In the heart of a community nestled between rolling hills and whispering pines, I stood as a pillar of justice, one who had earned the respect of my neighbors and colleagues alike. My name is often associated with fairness, integrity, and a relentless pursuit of truth. I was not just a judge, I was a trusted figure whose decisions shaped the lives of many. While the role of a judge comes with the gravity of responsibility, it also bestows a unique position within the community, highlighting the importance of moral leadership where it often pulls back the veil on individuals' true natures. This particular neighborhood, with its quaint homes and well-manicured lawns, had always thrived on camaraderie. However, like any vibrant community, it had its dark undercurrents, especially within the Homeowners Association. It was here that my story begins to intertwine with Karen Smith, the fervent president of the HOA and a woman whose demeanor radiated authority but shadowed compassion. She advocated vehemently for community standards, often at the expense of empathy or understanding. From my earliest encounters with Karen, it was evident that her vision for our little enclave was rigid. The established rules often overstepped mere governance. They aimed to dictate lifestyles. I had heard whispers around town of her unreasonable demands, arcane fines for minor infractions, and aggressive recruitment strategies that pressured residents to join the HOA. Joining meant surrendering certain freedoms in favor of conformity to an ever-narrowing definition of what our community should be. Despite facing mounting pressure, I stood firmly against her authoritarian approach. My rejection of the HOA membership was not grounded merely in opposition to their bylaws but based on a philosophical belief that community is built on mutual respect, not coercion. I cherished our neighborhood's individuality, believing our collective strength lay in diversity rather than uniformity. My refusal wasn't born from rebellion but rather a heartfelt commitment to uphold values I believed were worth defending. As news of my stance spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, it soon reached Karen's ears. She didn't take kindly to dissent. The kind that came from someone in my position weighed heavily on her intentions. But she failed to realize that embodying true leadership meant seeking collaboration rather than enforcing compliance through fear and intimidation. I had always believed in open dialogue over suppression, a concept she clearly dismissed. This clash propelled me into an unsettling narrative, a power struggle disguised beneath a facade of civility that would soon escalate beyond mere disagreements at community meetings. At times, it felt surreal that between us lay not just bricks and mortar but an ideological chasm as wide as any divide I had seen in my courtroom. Little did I know how dramatically that divide would ripple throughout our lives, ultimately culminating in unprecedented tragedy, a terrifying reality where rejection could turn into retribution. The tension escalated quietly at first, but like an unnoticed spark waiting for dry timber, it simmered patiently while uncertainty hung heavy in the air. Little did either of us know how hard Karen would push back against defiance, and how far one person's contempt could stretch when pushed into a corner both emotionally and physically. In our community, the Homeowners Association was meant to be a unifying force, a group dedicated to preserving property values and enhancing our neighborhood's appeal. This idealistic vision quickly soured as Karen Smith and her board transformed the HOA into an entity of control rather than collaboration. Their relentless push for conformity created an atmosphere where dissent was not merely frowned upon but actively punished. Joining the HOA came with the allure of shared responsibility, meticulously kept parks, organized events, and collective decisions regarding community aesthetics. However, the reality was far more insidious. Membership required surrendering personal freedoms, as Karen enforced a strict adherence to rules that dictated everything from acceptable paint colors to lawn height. Many residents felt as though they were being watched under a microscope, their choices about their properties constantly scrutinized, and minor infractions met with hefty fines. The pressure to join was palpable. Karen often orchestrated membership drives that mingled social events with heavy-handed appeals. Those who hesitated or outright rejected the idea would find themselves on the receiving end of her ire, a tactic that bred division among neighbors who once enjoyed camaraderie. Rumors circulated about retaliation. Homeowners who refused membership faced increased scrutiny and unwelcome visits from HOA representatives on their doorsteps. As I witnessed these dynamics unfold, It became clear that Karen's vision for our community was rooted in control. It wasn't just about maintaining appearances. It transitioned into a regime of intimidation and exclusion. People started to whisper about the harsh realities behind those well-manicured lawns, how the fear of fines and repercussions lingered like an unseen storm cloud over us all. The consequences of refusal were dire and immediate. Neighbors began to report petty violations, everything from having holiday decorations up too long to failing to trim hedges on time, and these reports would swiftly lead to fines or threats of legal action. It was an unspoken understanding among residents that keeping one's head down was safest. Speaking out could invite unwanted attention. I refused to play along with this charade. My decision not to join was not out of rebellion but from a deep-rooted belief in community values that celebrated diversity rather than suppressing individuality. Refusing membership meant subjecting myself to potential retaliation, but I felt it necessary to take a stand against this tyrannical rule over our homes. Karen's response to my defiance intensified over time, much like a predator honing in on its prey. She viewed my refusal not just as a personal affront but as a challenge to her authority, a catalyst for her increasingly aggressive tactics. As she spun elaborate narratives about why every homeowner should comply, I sought support among fellow residents who shared my concerns but were too fearful to act upon them. The HOA's lack of flexibility echoed through the neighborhood, not only impacting individual homeowners but also fracturing relationships that had once made our community thrive. The rift grew deeper between those loyal to Karen and those yearning for genuine community spirit, setting in motion a series of events that would have devastating consequences for us all. Little did we realize how deep-rooted this conflict would become, or how it would eventually drive an irrevocable wedge between neighbor and neighbor in our once tightly knit enclave. Karen Smith had a commanding presence that was impossible to ignore. As the president of the HOA, she embodied authority in every gesture, from her crisp business attire to her unwavering gaze that felt like an unyielding spotlight fixed upon all who dared oppose her. With a practiced ability to blend charisma and intimidation, she captivated some residents while instilling fear in others. Once, she had been seen as a strong leader, but over time, that strength morphed into something darker, a relentless drive for control that pushed the boundaries of governance into overt oppression. The meetings she presided over often felt choreographed, with her agenda laid out meticulously and dissent swiftly silenced. Karen had a knack for interspersing her speeches with anecdotes and humor that made it easy for some to forget the iron fist hidden beneath the velvet glove. Yet, as I sat among my neighbors during these gatherings, I could sense an underlying tension brewing. Her flawless control of the room masked a growing unease. Those who disagreed learned quickly to keep their opinions muted or face the wrath of her sharpened tongue. She employed tactics that blurred the line between leadership and tyranny, strategies designed to isolate those who questioned her decisions. By fostering an atmosphere where neighbor reported neighbor for perceived infractions, Karen dismantled long-standing relationships, transforming friendly faces into wary rivals. Those who once shared casual conversations now exchanged glances filled with unspoken warnings. The camaraderie we had previously enjoyed was being torn apart by whispers and rumors incited by her overzealous enforcement of HOA regulations. Her authoritative demeanor extended beyond meetings. It permeated our everyday lives. From my own experience, I knew this firsthand after my refusal to join the HOA had put me firmly in her crosshairs. My noncompliance was more than just a personal choice. It was viewed as an affront to her authority, an act that warranted retaliation in her eyes. Conversations at community gatherings shifted toward cautiousness as residents began discussing potential repercussions of defying her wishes. As I stood firm against joining the HOA, Karen's aggression intensified. It seemed almost instinctual for her to identify threats to her power, and I quickly became top of mind. I witnessed how she would initiate campaigns against those who dissented. Unassuming homeowners found themselves at the receiving end of excessive fines or dubious claims about property violations that never existed until after they publicly questioned her decisions. It was under these conditions that the stage was set for conflict. People began to choose sides. Some rallied behind Karen, drawn in by promises of community improvement, while others sought refuge with me in quiet defiance of her regime. Yet no one anticipated how this struggle would unfold, not even Karen herself, or the lengths to which she would go to quell resistance. As tensions reached new heights, it was clear this was more than just a battle over property rights. It became a fight for our very identity as a community free from oppression. The fine line between neighborly disputes soared dangerously high, foreshadowing events yet to unfold, events that would forever alter not only my life but the fabric of our neighborhood itself. In hindsight, even I underestimated how deeply rooted Karen's desire for control ran and the drastic measures she would take when pushed against a wall with nowhere else to turn. The decision to refuse joining the HOA was not made lightly. It was a culmination of my personal values and a deep-seated belief in community that ultimately guided my choice. As a judge, I had spent years advocating for justice, fairness, and the idea that every voice deserves to be heard. The principles that governed my professional life extended into my personal ethos, values that emphasized respect for individuality and the importance of diverse perspectives. When I first encountered Karen Smith and her aggressive tactics, I felt my core beliefs being challenged. The very idea of an organization dictating how I should live in my own home struck me as both absurd and fundamentally wrong. My refusal to join was rooted in a conviction that participation should never come at the cost of one's freedom or personal autonomy. I saw the HOA as a vehicle for conformity rather than a means of fostering genuine community spirit. The pressure to conform grew steadily more oppressive, particularly as Karen intensified her recruitment efforts. Social gatherings became less about camaraderie and more about coaxing neighbors into compliance with her agenda. For many residents, it was easier to capitulate than to risk retaliation. They turned away from open dialogue in favor of silence, fearing the consequences that might arise from dissent. But for me, silence was not an option. I understood that taking a stand could lead to isolation or backlash, but I also recognized the importance of standing up against tyranny, even when it meant standing alone. I believed that our neighborhood thrived on its diversity, not just in appearance but in thought and lifestyle choices as well. The idea that we could be homogenized into a single vision of what it meant to live within our community felt like an affront to everything I held dear. Moreover, my role as a judge taught me the value of accountability. I knew firsthand how devastating unchecked power could be when wielded by those who sought to impose their will on others. It was imperative for me to confront this reality head-on. If I didn't stand for my rights today, what message would it send to those who looked up to me? My refusal was not merely personal, it became a symbol against the encroachment of authoritarianism. As whispers circulated around town regarding my stance against the HOA, I found unexpected allies among other residents who felt similarly constrained by Karen's rules but lacked the courage to voice their concerns publicly. This connection fostered a sense of solidarity among us, a reminder that we were not alone in our fight against oppression. Yet despite this camaraderie, the fear imposed by Karen's regime loomed large over our heads. It became increasingly clear that resisting her authority came with risks far greater than simply being marginalized at community events. It meant opening oneself up to potential acts of retaliation that could disrupt not just our lives but also our homes. Ultimately, my decision became less about refusing membership in an organization and more about standing firm for what is right, the right to choose how we live without fear or coercion. It ignited within me a fierce determination. If we were going to reclaim our sense of community from Karen's iron grip, we needed voices willing to speak out against injustice, even if it meant facing formidable opposition head-on. In doing so, I hope to inspire others to find their own voices amidst the turmoil, reinforcing the belief that true strength lies not only in individual resolve but also in collective action against tyranny. As my resolve to refuse joining the HOA solidified, so too did the tension between Karen Smith and me. The initial skirmishes began subtly, confrontations masked as polite discussions during community gatherings, where she would probe for weaknesses in my resolve. Each time I attended a meeting, I could feel her eyes fixed on me, evaluating my every reaction, seeking an opportunity to undermine my position. One evening at a particularly tense meeting, the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Karen had just introduced a new series of mandatory compliance measures that only served to tighten her grip on the neighborhood. When I raised my hand to voice my concerns about these overreaching regulations, her response was instantaneous and cutting. "If you have issues with how we run things here, perhaps you're in the wrong neighborhood," she retorted, her voice dripping with disdain. The room fell silent, but her pointed gaze invited murmurs of agreement from those too afraid to openly dissent. Days turned into weeks, and soon enough, her intimidation tactics began to escalate beyond verbal sparring. I received ominous letters stuffed into my mailbox, threats wrapped in thinly veiled warnings about code violations that didn't exist or fabrications regarding my property maintenance. One letter suggested that if I continued to reject membership in the HOA, I might find myself facing fines that could lead to legal action for supposed infractions. At first, I dismissed these threats as mere bluster, something out of character even for someone like Karen. Yet, as they continued unabated, I realized they were not just aimed at dissuading me from my stance, but were instilling fear among my neighbors. It was clear Karen sought to isolate me further while simultaneously casting a shadow over any support I might receive from fellow residents. The confrontations turned more aggressive. One fateful evening at a neighborhood barbecue was particularly revealing. As laughter mingled with the delicious aroma of grilled meat, Karen orchestrated an event designed not for community bonding but for surveillance and compliance checks. She approached me directly, feigning friendliness but letting slip snide remarks about the cost of non-compliance. Seizing the moment when others weren't watching closely enough, she leaned in closer and said in a low voice, "People like you don't belong here unless you follow the rules." Her words hung heavy in the air. Beneath that forced smile was an unmistakable threat. It felt as if she intended to make an example of anyone who dared challenge her authority, a tactic aimed not only at me but at everyone within earshot. The camaraderie around us began to dissolve as some neighbors looked away uncomfortably while others shifted nervously from foot to foot. It became increasingly clear that Karen's battle against dissent had little regard for personal safety or community peace. It was purely about asserting dominance. As I continued refusing to back down from my principles despite her threats, the animosity festered like an untreated wound, one that would soon erupt into chaos. With each passing day and every escalating confrontation, it was evident we were hurtling towards something inevitable, a culmination of tensions that could only end in confrontation or catastrophe. My steadfastness was becoming a beacon of resistance for some while simultaneously marking me as a target for others. This internal strife had morphed into something much larger than our individual struggles against an oppressive figurehead. It was becoming a battleground for liberty itself within our own homes. Little did either of us know how brutally this conflict would ultimately unfold, or how deeply it would scar our once harmonious community. The night my world transformed into ash began like any other, shrouded in an unsettling silence that had become all too familiar. Tensions with Karen Smith had escalated to a breaking point, and I could sense darkness creeping around me, not just in the shadows of my home but lurking outside in the community I had once cherished. Little did I know, that very night would mark the culmination of her vengeance, a ruthless act that would shatter my life and expose the depths of despair lurking within our neighborhood. As I lay in bed, fatigue enveloped me after yet another long day spent wrestling with both professional duties and the turmoil surrounding my defiance against the HOA. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale beams through my bedroom window when an abrupt crackle jolted me awake. At first, I dismissed it as an odd sound, perhaps a branch brushing against the house, but then came a second noise, sharper and more alarming. With heart racing, I leaped from my bed and rushed to the window. What I saw will forever be etched into my memory, flames flickering hungrily against the darkened sky, consuming the side of my home. Panic surged through me, forcing me into motion as I dashed down the hall to grab my phone and call 911. My hands trembled as I dialed. Each ring amplified my growing horror as reality set in. The fire was not just an accident, it was a deliberate act of arson. Outside, chaos erupted as neighbors gathered. Their faces were shadowed against the backdrop of fiery destruction engulfing my house. The acrid stench of smoke filled the air, mixing with shouts of disbelief and concern from those who dared approach closer to what remained of my sanctuary. In that chaotic moment, clarity dawned on me. I knew who was responsible for this heinous act. It had Karen's fingerprints all over it. As firefighters battled the blaze, panic morphed into profound sorrow that left me weak-kneed and trembling. Every flicker of flame seemed to consume not just wood and plaster but memories, birthdays celebrated under our roof, family gatherings filled with laughter, all evaporating before my eyes. The fire roared like a living entity intent on erasing everything that made our house a home. The emotional impact was staggering. Betrayal coursed through me like poison as I recognized how deeply intertwined our lives had become amidst this power struggle. What struck hardest was not just the loss of property but a shattered sense of safety within our community, a place where neighbors should nurture each other rather than orchestrate destruction out of disdain. In time, as rubble settled amidst resolute ashes, once vibrant walls now reduced to charred remains, I found myself grappling with profound anger along with lingering feelings of isolation. The realization hit me painfully hard. This wasn't merely a personal attack. Karen's actions signified something far more sinister, a message to anyone daring enough to challenge her authority. In those harrowing moments enveloped by devastation, I resolved that this would not mark the end for me, but rather ignite a fierce determination for justice. This brutal assault on my life would serve as both catalyst and clarion call. I would channel this pain into action against tyranny, a war cry echoing across our neighborhood demanding accountability for those willing to go to such lengths simply to silence dissent. The journey ahead promised uncertainty and struggle, but one thing became crystal clear. I could no longer remain silent or complacent while Karen reigned supreme over our community's fate. The battle lines were drawn. My fight for truth would begin anew amid ashes and embers left behind by her cruelty. It was time for retribution, not just for myself but for everyone who felt vulnerable under her oppressive rule, and make it known that we would rise stronger from these flames together. In the aftermath of the devastating fire that consumed my home, the community was abuzz with speculation and concern. The flames had left not only physical destruction but also a trail of questions that demanded answers. As a respected judge, I knew the importance of pursuing the truth, and I felt a surge of determination to investigate the circumstances surrounding the fire, especially given my growing suspicions about Karen Smith's involvement. The first step was to gather evidence, so I reached out to the local fire department to obtain their report on the incident. The investigators were thorough, documenting everything from the point of origin to potential accelerants used in the fire. As I delved deeper into their findings, it became clear there was more than met the eye. The fire had started in an area that was easily accessible from the outside, raising immediate red flags that suggested foul play rather than a simple accident. Simultaneously, I began to compile a timeline of events leading up to the fire. I recalled countless encounters where Karen had threatened and belittled me in front of other residents, her disdain for my refusal to join the HOA palpable. I initiated conversations with neighbors who had witnessed these exchanges, gathering their testimonies to establish a pattern of intimidation that painted a vivid picture of Karen's character. As I pieced together this information, my suspicions were further confirmed by the accounts of several residents who had seen unfamiliar vehicles parked near my house on the night of the fire. They described dark sedans with tinted windows lingering in the vicinity shortly before the flames erupted. It was as if they were waiting for something, perhaps waiting for me to fall asleep before executing their plan. With each revelation, my resolve only strengthened. I decided to speak with local law enforcement, sharing my concerns about Karen and her oppressive tactics. The officers were initially skeptical, given that arson cases often lack definitive evidence linking suspects to crimes. However, as I presented them with my timeline and witness accounts, their demeanor shifted. They agreed to take my claims seriously and launched an official investigation into both the fire and Karen's involvement. Days turned into weeks as I waited for answers, a period marked by both apprehension and anticipation. During this time, as I observed Karen continue her reign over the HOA, it became evident she was not just a tyrant but a master manipulator who thrived on instilling fear among residents. Reports began to surface about increased surveillance around homes of those who had spoken out against her, an eerie reminder that she would stop at nothing to maintain control. As investigators worked diligently behind the scenes, I took it upon myself to rally community members who had suffered under Karen's governance. We formed an informal coalition dedicated not only to uncovering the truth about the arson but also to reclaiming our neighborhood from her grip. Each meeting brought more residents forward with stories of intimidation and harassment they'd endured at her hands. The growing momentum placed additional pressure on law enforcement, who began connecting the dots between Karen's actions and the recent arson case. Officials started interviewing Karen's known associates within the HOA, looking for those who might possess incriminating information or evidence against her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of uncertainty and fear, I received a call from the detectives leading the investigation. They had uncovered crucial evidence linking Karen to the crime, a set of fingerprints on items found at the scene that tied back to her personal belongings. It became increasingly clear that my suspicions were not mere paranoia, they were grounded in reality. As I stood at this pivotal moment, filled with both dread and hope, I understood that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The fight for justice was far from over, but I was ready to face Karen with all the resolve I could muster. The stakes had never been higher, not just for me but for every resident yearning for safety and freedom within our community once again. With the detectives confirming that evidence directly linked Karen Smith to the arson, I felt a renewed sense of purpose ignite within me. As a respected judge, I had spent my career upholding the law and ensuring that justice prevailed, and now I was determined to leverage my legal expertise and community standing to hold Karen accountable for her heinous actions. This was not merely about my personal loss. It was about restoring a sense of justice and safety to the entire neighborhood. I began by assembling a comprehensive case file, meticulously documenting every piece of evidence gathered thus far. The fingerprints found at the scene were critical, but I knew that building a strong case required more than just physical evidence. I reached out to residents willing to testify about their encounters with Karen, her threats, her manipulation, and her attempts to intimidate anyone who dared oppose her reign. Each statement painted a vivid picture of an individual who had exploited her power for personal gain. As I prepared for what would likely become a contentious legal battle, I also recognized the importance of rallying support from my neighbors. They needed to see that this fight was not solely mine. It was a collective stand against an oppressive force that sought to stifle our voices. I organized community meetings where we could discuss our shared experiences under Karen's rule, allowing others to find strength in their stories. These gatherings fostered camaraderie and solidarity among residents who felt marginalized by the HOA's tactics. As we spoke openly about the fear that had permeated our community, a palpable shift occurred. People began to feel empowered. During one of these meetings, I shared my vision for pursuing justice against Karen. "This isn't just about one house burning down," I proclaimed. "It's about all of us reclaiming our right to live freely in our own homes. We deserve to feel safe and respected in our community." My words resonated deeply. I could see heads nodding in agreement, eyes lighting up with newfound determination. Equipped with testimonials and bolstered by community support, I approached law enforcement once more, pushing for a deeper investigation into Karen's activities as HOA president. The narrative had shifted. We were no longer viewing this as just an isolated incident but as part of a broader pattern of intimidation and abuse of power. The detectives agreed to pursue additional inquiries into any potential illegal practices within the HOA, financial discrepancies, harassment claims, and they began interviewing other neighbors who had suffered at Karen's hands. The momentum was building, and I could feel the tide turning. As days turned into weeks, whispers of Karen's possible downfall echoed throughout our neighborhood. People began sharing stories not just of intimidation, but also of how her oppressive rule had impacted their lives, sparking outrage among those who had remained silent for too long. However, with every step forward came reminders of the risks involved in challenging someone like Karen Smith. There were moments of doubt where her presence loomed large, a shadow cast over this new pursuit of justice, but I leaned on the solidarity we'd fostered within the community. We were no longer individuals hiding in fear. We were standing united against a common enemy. As my determination solidified into unwavering resolve, I prepared for the possibility of legal action against Karen, not only for the arson but also for the emotional toll her actions had taken on me and my neighbors. The stakes had never been higher. Failure was not an option. This fight promised to be arduous and fraught with challenges, yet it also held the potential for profound change. Armed with my legal acumen and backed by an invigorated community eager for justice, I was ready to take on Karen Smith, a battle not just for myself but for every person who longed to reclaim their voice and sense of safety within our neighborhood once more. As I continued to form my case against Karen Smith, I became increasingly aware of the need to build a coalition with other community members who had faced similar issues with the HOA. My resolve was not simply about proving her guilt. It was about dismantling the culture of fear and manipulation she had created. I realized that in order to challenge her effectively, I needed to rally those who had suffered under her regime, creating a united front that could not be easily dismissed. I started by organizing informal gatherings at my temporary residence. A supportive neighbor had extended their home as a safe space while I navigated this tumultuous time. Word spread quickly through the community about these meetings. Residents began to filter in, some hesitant but curious, holding on to stories they had long kept bottled up. As they shared their experiences of intimidation, excessive fines for trivial matters, and the oppressive presence of Karen's enforcers within the HOA, a sense of camaraderie blossomed. "Tell your story," I urged each person who spoke up. "Your experiences matter. We're all in this together." With each testimony, a tapestry of shared experience emerged, one that linked otherwise isolated incidents into a larger narrative of systemic corruption bent on quashing dissent. One particularly striking account came from an elderly couple who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. They recounted how Karen enforced rules so rigidly that they felt they couldn't even decorate for the holidays without fear of reprimand. Their stories resonated with many in attendance. Everyone had felt the crushing weight of her power. With these poignant narratives in hand, I recognized an opportunity. I proposed we formalize our coalition, a group dedicated to standing up against Karen and re-establishing community governance based on respect rather than fear. We began drafting a charter for our group, outlining our goals, increasing transparency within the HOA, fighting back against arbitrary regulations, and fostering genuine community connections where every voice could be heard. The momentum behind our coalition grew rapidly. Residents began reaching out to others who might be intimidated into silence by Karen's reign. It became evident that my fight was no longer just singular. People were stepping forward to share their grievances and join forces in a way that would multiply our impact exponentially. Women and men alike began attending meetings, emboldened by shared purpose, each carrying stories of their struggles against Karen's tactics. Simultaneously, we initiated a door-to-door campaign to gather more testimonies from those reluctant to speak openly at meetings. Armed with clipboards and conviction, our coalition members approached neighbors with friendly smiles and open ears. The response exceeded all expectations. Many were eager to share their stories yet cautious about doing so publicly due to fear of retribution from the HOA. As we compiled information from countless residents, it became clear that Karen's grip on the community was built on layers of manipulation and control supported by nothing but intimidation tactics. It was imperative that we dismantled this facade and brought her actions into public scrutiny. Once we felt we had sufficient testimonies and evidence documenting a broader pattern of abuse within the HOA, we prepared to present our findings to law enforcement and local media outlets. I understood that shining a light on these injustices would not only contribute to my case but would also invite others who had suffered in silence to join us in reclaiming our community. The final push came together elegantly as our coalition met one last time before taking these steps. Enthusiasm filled the room. It was no longer just about me or my house burning down. It was about ensuring this wouldn't happen again to another resident. The time for change had arrived, igniting hope amidst despair that resonated throughout our community. Armed with collective determination and bolstered by each individual's bravery coming together, I felt truly ready for battle, not just against Karen Smith but against the corrupt system she embodied, a fight for justice pushing against a tide long held in secrecy and fear. The outcome felt uncertain, but what mattered most was our unity and willingness to stand firm together in uncovering truth within a once divided neighborhood. We would reclaim both safety and dignity from the ruins left behind by years of oppression. The day of the trial arrived, and the air in the courtroom crackled with tension. I stood at the front, clad in a navy suit that felt like armor, ready to confront Karen Smith and her legal team. This was not just a battle for justice regarding my home. It was a fight to expose her oppressive regime and restore dignity to our community. I could feel the weight of my neighbors' expectations behind me, their hopes resting on this moment. As the proceedings commenced, Karen's attorney, a slick and experienced litigator named Mark Thompson, wasted no time establishing his strategy. He opened with a confident statement that painted Karen as a victim of unfounded accusations. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "this case is built on speculation and hearsay, not facts. The fire was tragic, yes, but there is no solid evidence linking my client to any wrongdoing." I could see how easily he wielded his words. His polished demeanor aimed to sway the jury's sympathies away from me and toward Karen. But as he spoke, I felt a surge of determination. I had prepared for this moment meticulously, and knew that I needed to counteract his narrative effectively. I took the stand as my first witness. My voice remained steady as I recounted the events leading up to the fire, the threats, the intimidation tactics Karen employed against me and my neighbors, and the evidence connecting her directly to the crime. As I detailed how our community had suffered under her rule, I watched as jurors leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the undeniable truth of our collective experiences. Karen's cross-examination came swiftly. Mark tried to undermine my credibility by questioning my motives. "Isn't it true that your refusal to join the HOA may have led you to fabricate these claims against Ms. Smith?" His words dripped with insinuation, as if suggesting that my pursuit of justice was merely personal vendetta disguised as righteousness. "Not at all," I replied firmly. "My refusal was based on principles of transparency and fairness that I believe every community deserves. This is about exposing corruption." The courtroom atmosphere shifted as I maintained eye contact with jurors. They seemed to appreciate my resolve against intimidation tactics that had long silenced many voices in our neighborhood. As witnesses began to line up, neighbors who told their stories of fear and oppression at Karen's hands, the tide further turned. Each testimony added layers to our case, illustrating a consistent pattern of abuse that ran deep within the HOA culture. The more we presented evidence of Karen's manipulation, both financially and socially, the more it became clear that she was not just an isolated figure but emblematic of a corrupt system. In what felt like an unexpected twist during a break in proceedings, an anonymous witness stepped forward with vital information. They had seen Karen near my house on the night of the fire, leaving just moments before it erupted into flames. This revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Mark scrambled to regain control of the narrative but struggled as our coalition continued to build momentum both inside and outside during breaks. Community members gathered outside the courthouse holding signs demanding justice, not just for me but for everyone who had suffered under Karen's reign. As closing arguments loomed, I understood this would be my chance to encapsulate everything we had fought for, not only against arson but against tyranny itself. My heart raced as I presented our case one final time. "This trial is about more than one act of arson. It's about standing up against corruption in all its forms." With each word driven by passion and conviction, I urged the jury not just to find Karen guilty but also to recognize their own power in reclaiming their community from fear. The outcome would determine not only my fate but also signal whether we could dismantle the oppressive regime that had kept so many silent for far too long. As deliberation began, I held on to hope that our collective effort would finally bring forth justice and begin healing wounds inflicted over years of oppression within our once vibrant neighborhood. Whatever happened next would shape our lives forever. It was time for change, for accountability, and above all else, for truth to prevail in this long-fought battle for justice against corruption personified by Karen Smith. As the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that the courtroom was not just a battleground for my case against Karen Smith. It was also a platform for unraveling the deep-seated corruption within the Homeowners Association. Each day brought new revelations that not only implicated Karen, but also exposed systemic issues that had plagued our community for far too long. During the testimonies, it was impossible to ignore the threads of deceit woven throughout the HOA's practices. Neighbors, once hesitant to speak, began to share their stories with fervor. One woman detailed how she had been fined exorbitant amounts for minor landscaping violations, only to discover later that these fines were funneled into community projects, controlled exclusively by Karen and her allies. This revelation raised eyebrows among jurors and observers alike, who began to see a pattern of financial exploitation that extended beyond mere intimidation. Another witness, a retired accountant, took the stand and provided a chilling analysis of the HOA's financial records. He revealed discrepancies that suggested funds were being misallocated, money intended for community maintenance and improvements mysteriously vanishing. It wasn't just about enforcing rules, he explained. It was about lining their own pockets. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief as people began to connect the dots between Karen's oppressive tactics and her secret accumulation of wealth at the expense of residents. The more these secrets surfaced, the more emboldened our coalition became outside the courtroom. Community members who had once felt powerless were now rallying together, sharing flyers and organizing protests outside during breaks in proceedings. Signs demanding accountability held high above their heads sent a clear message: Karen's reign would no longer be tolerated. The solidarity among us grew stronger with each passing day, transforming fear into resilience. Inside the courtroom, strategic maneuvers from both sides became increasingly evident. While my attorney worked diligently to present a cohesive narrative that highlighted Karen's abuses, Mark Thompson launched counterattacks aimed at discrediting our witnesses. He attempted to portray them as disgruntled residents with personal vendettas rather than victims of systemic oppression. Yet with every attempt, he inadvertently reinforced our narrative of Karen's manipulative leadership style, making it harder for jurors to ignore the collective suffering we had endured. In one particularly pivotal moment, I leaned into my role as a judge and framed my closing argument around principles we both held dear: fairness and accountability. "This isn't just about me or my home," I asserted passionately to the jury. "This is about every resident who has felt bullied into submission. It's time we expose this culture of fear and reclaim our community." As deliberations commenced, I could see that community awareness had not only increased but had also shifted public opinion against Karen Smith and her corrupt practices. People were now openly discussing their grievances on social media platforms and organizing community forums where transparency and HOA governance became a rallying cry. The trial had transcended its original purpose. It became a catalyst for change that challenged not just Karen's authority, but also prompted residents to critically examine the power dynamics within our neighborhood. It was exhilarating to witness how this collective awakening unfolded. The realization that we could no longer remain silent in the face of corruption. As we awaited the jury's verdict, I felt a wave of cautious optimism wash over me. Regardless of the outcome, I knew we had ignited a movement toward justice and transparency. The secrets of the HOA had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. Our community was ready to stand up for what was right and demand accountability from those who had exploited their power for too long. In that moment of uncertainty, I held on to hope that our fight would redefine our neighborhood's future and restore dignity where it had been stripped away for far too long. The day the verdict was announced, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. I could feel the tension radiating from my neighbors gathered behind me, their faces a mix of hope and anxiety. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and revelations about the depths of corruption within the Homeowners Association, we were finally at a turning point that would determine not only my fate but also the future of our community. When the jury entered and took their seats, a hush fell over the room. The foreman stood, his expression grave as he began to read their decision. "We find the defendant, Karen Smith, guilty of arson and conspiracy to commit fraud." Gasps erupted from the gallery. Disbelief mingled with relief as tears welled in many eyes. In that moment, I felt a surge of vindication wash over me, a recognition that our fight for justice had not been in vain. As Karen's expression shifted from arrogance to shock, I saw her world begin to crumble. The implications of this verdict were profound. It meant accountability for her actions and an end to her tyrannical rule over our neighborhood. My heart raced at the thought of how this decision would affect not just Karen but the corrupt practices embedded within the HOA itself. This was a watershed moment, one that promised to dismantle a regime that had long silenced dissent through fear and intimidation. In the days following the verdict, discussions echoed throughout our community. Neighbors who had once hesitated to speak out now rallied together with newfound vigor, motivated by the courage displayed during the trial. Town hall meetings filled with residents eager to share their experiences and ideas for reform became common. We were no longer whispering behind closed doors. Our voices resonated louder than ever before. The local media flocked to cover this unfolding story, bringing attention not only to Karen's conviction but also to broader issues regarding HOA governance across many neighborhoods. Articles highlighting our struggle against oppression sparked interest in surrounding communities facing similar challenges. We had ignited a dialogue about accountability and transparency in homeowners associations nationwide. Meanwhile, as we began discussing plans for reforming our HOA's bylaws, it became clear that we could no longer allow a small group to dictate how we lived our lives. The conviction had opened doors for discussions on implementing checks and balances within our governing entity, measures designed to ensure that no individual could wield power unchecked again. Karen's sentencing day came all too quickly. As she stood before the judge awaiting her fate, I felt an odd mixture of compassion and resolve. I understood that her actions stemmed from something deeper, a desire for control perhaps born out of insecurity, but they had caused irreparable harm to so many lives. As she received her sentence, I knew it was time for us to move forward. With new leadership emerging among residents committed to fostering community engagement rather than fear-based compliance, I felt hopeful for what lay ahead. A group was forming, one driven by principles of transparency and mutual respect rather than intimidation. As we stepped into this new chapter together, I reflected on how far we had come since that fateful night when my house burned down. The sense of loss had transformed into empowerment. What began as a personal struggle had evolved into a movement capable of reshaping our neighborhood's identity. In that moment of clarity amid uncertainty, it became evident we were ready to reclaim not just our homes but also our community spirit. Together, we would build a brighter future founded on trust and collective resilience against any forces seeking to undermine it again. With hope blossoming anew among us, there was no turning back. We would forever carry forward this hard-won lesson about standing up against tyranny and embracing accountability in all its forms. In the wake of Karen Smith's conviction, the community began to reflect on the broader implications of the trial and its impact on the Homeowners Association. The verdict not only brought accountability for Karen's criminal actions but also acted as a catalyst for systemic change within the HOA itself. Residents who had long felt powerless were now empowered to participate actively in reshaping the very governance that had once oppressed them. The initial discussions centered around reforming HOA policies to ensure greater transparency and fairness. We organized town hall meetings where everyone could voice their concerns and propose new bylaws aimed at preventing the kind of manipulation that had characterized Karen's leadership. The atmosphere shifted from one of fear to one of hope and ambition. We were determined to reclaim our rights as homeowners and neighbors. One major change proposed was the implementation of term limits for HOA board members, ensuring that power would not remain concentrated in the hands of a few individuals for extended periods. This move resonated strongly with residents, as many had witnessed firsthand how prolonged control could lead to corruption and a disconnect from community needs. Additionally, we pushed for mandatory financial disclosures from the board, instilling confidence that funds would be managed responsibly and transparently. As these ideas took shape, we also focused on increasing member participation in HOA meetings. Many residents had previously avoided attending out of fear or apathy, believing their voices wouldn't matter. But with renewed vigor, we launched a campaign encouraging attendance, emphasizing that every opinion counted in shaping our neighborhood's future. Flyers were distributed, social media posts shared, and word-of-mouth discussions spread throughout our community. The excitement was palpable. People wanted to engage in their community again. Our coalition worked tirelessly to educate residents about their rights within the HOA framework. We hosted workshops about bylaws, financial literacy, and community governance to empower homeowners with knowledge they had previously lacked. The response exceeded all expectations, each session filled to capacity as residents sought to understand how they could reclaim control over their living environment. The momentum culminated in an extraordinary HOA meeting where proposed changes were put to a vote. For many, it was their first time participating in such a process, and I could feel a sense of pride swell in the room as voices that had been silenced for so long were finally heard. When the results were announced, overwhelming support for the proposed reforms, cheers erupted throughout the gathering. It was a collective victory against years of oppression. As we celebrated this newfound empowerment, I reflected on how far we had come since my home burned down, a traumatic experience that had initially felt like a devastating loss but ultimately became a turning point for the entire community. The fire had sparked an awakening among us. It forced us to confront fears and insecurities and transform them into resilience and solidarity. The changes implemented within our HOA marked only the beginning of our journey toward reclaiming our neighborhood spirit. An ongoing commitment to transparency, engagement, and mutual respect among residents was now firmly established as our guiding principle. As I looked around at my neighbors, faces once filled with anxiety now bright with determination, I knew we were on a path towards healing and rebuilding not just our homes but our community identity. Together, we forged ahead with optimism, ready to face any challenges that might arise in the future. The lessons learned through adversity strengthened our resolve. We would remain vigilant against any forces seeking to undermine our hard-won progress. In this new chapter of our lives as engaged citizens within an accountable HOA, we stood united, no longer under tyranny but thriving together in partnership for a brighter future. As I stood amidst the vibrant energy of our transformed community, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that brought us here. The conviction of Karen Smith had been a catalyst, igniting a flame of change and resilience that burned brighter than any fire she had ignited. My personal struggle had evolved into a collective movement, intertwining my fate with countless neighbors who had grappled with fear and oppression for far too long. In the weeks following the trial, I witnessed a remarkable metamorphosis unfold within our neighborhood. Residents who had once felt silence began to find their voices. People who merely existed under Karen's oppressive regime now thrived, feeling empowered to express their opinions and engage in meaningful dialogue about our shared living environment. The change was palpable. Our community was becoming a model of engagement and accountability rather than a breeding ground for fear. We organized regular meetings that buzzed with excitement, each candid discussion allowing us to dismantle the barriers built around misinformation and intimidation that had once kept us divided. As we explored new avenues for participation in HOA governance, it became mandatory for all board meetings to be open to the public, allowing residents to access discussions about policies that affected their lives directly. This newfound transparency transformed an exclusive club into an inclusive body that reflected community needs and aspirations. The conversations among neighbors grew richer as we swapped ideas for community projects that aimed to enhance our shared spaces and foster unity. From organizing cleanup days in local parks to planning seasonal events designed to celebrate our diverse backgrounds, vibrant life stirred within our community once more. The desire to not only reclaim spaces but redefine them became a rallying call as creativity flourished among us. I often reflected on the difficulties we had faced in leading up to this point. I realized that my personal journey, once marked by a sense of isolation, had allowed me to cultivate a deeper appreciation for community spirit. I learned invaluable lessons about empathy, hope, and courage. Encouraging my neighbors to embrace their narratives helped me find strength in vulnerability, fostering connections not just based on confrontation but collaboration. However, even as we celebrated our victories, there lingered a quiet awareness that threats from corrupt leadership could resurface if we grew complacent. To mitigate this risk, we began working on educational initiatives aimed at teaching residents about their rights within the association. Holding workshops on bylaws and governance ensured that any future attempts at tyranny would be met with informed resistance rooted in solidarity. There was also a collective commitment to maintaining our vigilance against corruption within the HOA's leadership structure. When nominations arose for board positions, we encouraged participation from residents across the spectrum, introducing fresh perspectives ready to address challenges without ideological barriers hindering progress. Ensuring diversity of thought became necessary not only for accountability but also as a safeguard against repeating past mistakes. As time went on, it became evident that this trial extended beyond the courtroom. It was about reshaping community identity itself. We were witnessing the return of a spirit that refused to be quashed by intimidation, a collective force ready not just to reclaim individual homes, but also to nurture bonds reflecting trust, cooperation, and shared ambition. Amidst this revitalization, I felt an unwavering sense of pride swell within me. We had turned pain into purpose and loss into empowerment. Together, we embraced this new chapter, a testament to resilience forged in adversity, as we moved forward with determination to ensure that never again would tyranny suffocate our community's spirit. United by ambition and informed advocacy, we prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing this time our collective resolve would remain steadfast against any force seeking to undermine our hard-won progress.